time. It's our time, my friends. Time for millions of maturepreneurs, 55 plus, who are hashtag not done by a long shot, to revolutionize how we lead, do business, and innovate our world. I'm your host, Jeanette Anderson, and welcome to my conversations with fascinating people who would rather inspire than retire. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Maturepreneur Podcast. I'm the Maturepreneur Maverick, Jeanette Anderson, and I'm here today with Ashton Applewhite, who is the author of the internationally recognized author of This Chair Rocks, a manifesto. It's not going to work very well. A Manifesto Against Ageism. And it is one of the best books that I've read. So I reached out and said, hey, I would love to get to know you better. I would love to have you and bring you to my audience. So thank you so much for being here, Ashton.
My pleasure, Jeanette.
So let me tell you the official info on Ashton. Then we'll start talking about all those things that you wouldn't necessarily guess, what brought her here, her purpose in the world, and some of the work that she's doing that is actually just really making a huge difference. So Ashton is an internationally recognized expert on ageism. Ashton Applewhite's the author of This Chair Rocks, a Manifesto Against Ageism, and is a co-founder of the Old School Anti-Ageism Clearinghouse. She speaks widely at venues that have included the United Nations and the TED mainstage, and is at the forefront of the emerging movement to raise awareness of ageism and make age a criterion for diversity. In 2022, the United Nations named Ashton one of the Healthy Aging 50 leaders transforming the world to be a better place to grow older. That is quite the accomplishment and accolade. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. No, I feel like, okay, I don't need anything else in terms of recognition, honestly.
Yeah. Really, well, that's a pretty big one. You know, you're 50 people in the world that's making a huge global impact. That's pretty significant.
Thank you. It felt amazing.
And how did this whole journey start for you? How did you begin on this journey? Because, you know, I can kind of tell, just even having met you, that you've probably been a disruptor most of your life. Is that true?
So, I mean, I'm lucky enough to have been able to be, well, partly self-employed for the last 15 years. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have never had a career plan. I never intended to be a writer. I certainly never thought I would be a public figure. But when I get my, what's the bit between my teeth on a topic, I am very persistent. That sort of comes to me naturally. And I don't know whether I trust my own instincts or I'm just bullheaded. But, you know, early on in this project, I remember thinking that if I couldn't sell an idea that made everyone my age, and I was born in 1952, so dead center of the baby boom, feel better about getting older, I was really an idiot. But it took a long time to find my way, that's for sure.
And so have you been, we'll call it tilting at windmills. Have you been railing against the status quo in other arenas, or is this something that was new to you as you matured?
Both. My first serious book was called it's in print, Cutting Loose, Why Women Who End Their Marriages Do So Well. And it was published in the early 80s as all these dismal studies were coming out saying if you were, you know, divorced, you were going to live on saltines for the rest of your life and never have a love life, and that it was a terrible thing to do. And don't get me wrong, no one wants to get divorced. It is indeed, you know, not anyone's first choice, but it is better than staying in a miserable marriage. But that was very much running against the cultural current. Mm-hmm. And then some 15 or 20 years later, I looked in the mirror and thought, hey, this, you know, getting old thing, it is actually happening to me. Imagine that. And that was when I was in my mid 50s. And so I started learning about longevity and interviewing people over 80. I had no training. I had no professional affiliations. I had no degrees. I just dug in because that's what I like to do. I like to read, I like to research. And it became obvious in a matter of months that my view of later life was much grimmer and less and inaccurate, than the reality. And that the biggest obstacle was ageism, these stereotypes and false beliefs about aging.
Mhm.
And that it was bad for us individually and collectively. So I got that bee in my bonnet and started blogging. Do you want the whole short story of how it went?
Yeah.
Well, I started a blog because it was the 80s and everyone had blogs. And I thought, oh, I can just be like this modern writer and just like blog and tweet, and I won't ever have to write another book, because writing a book is, for me, really hard and really awful.
Mm.
I was wrong. I had to write another book, but and then gradually I was invited to give a monologue at a theater festival, and the theme was aging. And
Mm.
just a little anecdote there, it's run by a friend, as everything is who we know. And she picks a theme every year. And when she picked aging, her colleague said, God, why are you going to do something so depressing? No one's going to show up. And she tripled her subscriber base. This is a conversation that we not only need, we are hungry for, as you know, because you are part of building that
Mhm.
conversation. And that became my first talk, a monologue. And then I kept writing, I kept blogging, and gradually built an audience. I was able to keep at it because I had for almost 20 years a part-time job as a staff writer at the Museum of Natural History. So I could do this in the rest of my time. And then at all the same time, basically, the spring that I turned 65 was the year I gave my TED Talk. And so I quit the museum job, got on Medicare, and got a speakers bureau because of the TED Talk. And then they started charging serious money for my speaking. And also I sold the book. I had to self-publish the book, but then I sold it 2 years later to a new division of Macmillan. So that was another source of revenue, and I have been able to support myself ever since.
Oh, that's awesome. And it's awesome because it's a commitment to a journey without worrying about the how as much as the commitment to the journey, and then having it become and unfold in the way that supports you
Yeah.
practically and emotionally and mentally and so forth. And so for someone who doesn't like writing that much or creating a book, it sounds like you do a lot of writing.
Oh, I procrastinate, like all of us. I know my daughter said to me once, Ma, why do you write if it's so awful? And
uh-huh.
which is true. When I read something smart that I have written, it makes me feel great. And
Mm.
I honestly think, I hope this doesn't sound pretentious, but everyone in the world is living longer. And the biggest obstacle to personal well-being around that is this idea that it's all going to suck. And let me say very clearly, there are real things to be apprehensive about getting older, running out of money, getting sick. Those fears are legitimate and real. I am not poo-pooing them. But
Mhm.
an ageist culture only tells you the scary stuff,
Mhm.
right? And that fear is bad for us individually. It's bad for our self-esteem. It isolates us from each other through age segregation. It's terrible for our work lives. And so writing is the way I get these ideas out in the world. And it feels really important to do so. In a way, I feel like I am a vessel for these ideas, an outlet for these ideas that are much, much bigger than me. And my dream, of course, is that other people will appropriate what I've written, build on what I've written so that it'll outlive me by far, I hope, forever.
Mhm. And create some tangible change now while you're here.
Oh, it's
Because I
happening.
think that's the real issue here is awareness is great, but action that becomes out of the awareness is what's really important. And
Right, but you need the awareness
yeah,
to provoke the action.
yeah, absolutely. So tell me a little bit about you when you were little. So what was little Ashton like, and what what would surprise us to learn about you?
Um, I'm bad at this. I'm not very self-reflective. I was a tomboy.
Mhm.
I wished I was a boy. I probably, who knows now, who knows? I probably would have been called myself non-binary, either because I was or am, or because it was a way to sort of avoid the awfulness of figuring out all those things in early adolescence. I'm glad I'm a woman.
Mhm.
Um, I think women's lives are more interesting. But um, I've never had a career plan. Back when I had a real job, not counting the museum job, which was a real job, I worked for a little while in book publishing
Mhm.
because I like to read. Um, I have sort of followed my instincts and had the privilege, the luck, and the temperament to stick with something if it seemed like a good idea.
Mm.
Something that would surprise you about me is that I don't like school.
Oh, yeah, you're right. For someone who likes research and learning and a writer, you're right. That's interesting. Is that because it's too structured, too many rules? Why don't you
I
like
don't
school?
know why. I still have nightmares about not being able to find my locker, and not handing in assignments on time. And I never handed an assignment in late. I don't know why. I just don't like it.
Ah, okay. There you go. And so for those who may not know, how would you define ageism?
The dictionary definition is discrimination and stereotyping on the basis of age. Age is to ageism as race is to racism, as gender really is to sexism. We are being ageist anytime we make an assumption about someone or a group of people on the basis of how old we think they are. Typically, too old, air quotes around that,
Hmm.
because there's no such thing as too old,
Hmm.
or too young,
Yeah,
right? Ageism cuts both ways.
yeah.
It's any judgment on the basis of age, and younger people experience a lot of it too.
Exactly, exactly. It's interesting. I was just talking to want to do a speaking tour, and I was just talking to a friend who's a big member of the Rotary. Rotary does a lot of funding for nonprofits, etc. And kind of gently pitched him on the idea of a tour about awareness around ageism and the challenges and issues facing people that are olders, as you call them. And he basically said, no, we support disadvantaged communities. And I said, well, first of all, not everybody who's older has a lot of money. And in fact, a big reason why there's millions of people who are still working into their 70s and 80s is because they have to. They don't.
Absolutely. And all the members of whatever community they are already supporting, some of those people are old. And if they're lucky, the rest are going to get old. So it really is
Exactly.
everyone.
Exactly. Well, and he said, yeah, no, it tends to, we tend to have more of a focus on children, youth, etc., sometimes single moms, etc., but mostly a lot of it is younger. And I thought, what an interesting ageist um, barrier
Mindset.
to run up against. It's like,
Ah,
oh, you won't fund us because we're older, but younger people need help, but older people don't. Interesting.
and that idea, as I'm sure you know, presumes that older and younger people are not connected. That if your kid can't find a job or your mom gets laid off, it's not a problem for the person, in the other age cohort. And of course, we are connected to each other. It's such a siloed and way to look at it, which when we need, of course, the opposite to tackle these big social problems.
Exactly. So tell me a little bit about the journey of writing your book. So what did you learn that really surprised you as you were doing this? About yourself or about ageism or about the world? What surprised you as you were doing this?
Oh, everything surprised me at the beginning because I didn't know anything.
Mm.
And I had this very grim view of late life.
Mhm.
So I thought, for example, that the odds of ending up in a nursing home were pretty good.
Mhm.
And when I wrote the book, the percentage of Americans in nursing homes, mind you, that's skilled nursing care. That's not all senior living. The
Mhm.
percentage of Americans over 65 was 4%. Now it's 2.5%. And
I
I
know.
believe
That's
in Canada it's 3, I think.
that stunned me when I read that. Like
Yeah.
stunned me because
Yeah.
my mother was in care, and so it was a big part of my, zeitgeist at the time. And I thought, like many people, most of us end up there. I was really shocked that the percentage was that low.
Or odds of getting Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm.
The odds, did you know that the odds are dropping, that the incidence of Alzheimer's is dropping?
I didn't know that. I actually would have thought it was rising because of some of the chemical causes and stress causes and so forth.
It is not. We don't know why it's not. There are a number of diseases. So there are not very many actual diseases of old age, but Parkinson's and Alzheimer's are two of them. The incidence is dropping overall, and we don't know why. I want to be clear also that there are more cases than there used to be because older people are a bigger percentage of the population, and age is the biggest risk factor. But the odds of you or I getting Alzheimer's have gotten lower and lower, and people are being diagnosed at later ages. And this connects directly to, I think, a very powerful example of why being ageist is bad for us. This wonderful scholar at Yale named Becca Levy has done most of the research on this, including a study, loads of research that connects attitudes towards aging to physical and mental function. And people with a more, she says, a more positive attitude towards aging, I say a more accurate attitude, are less likely to develop Alzheimer's, wait for it, even if they have the gene that predisposes them to the disease, right? That's a shoe drop. That's a mic drop. And the reason they think is because this more robust, accurate attitude helps protect you against stress. In this case, the effects of living in an ageist society that says, you know, you're useless, you should shut up and shuffle off stage. So every time we can't find our glasses, if we think, oh my God, that's probably the first sign of Alzheimer's, that's a terrifying idea, it's stressful. If you are versed in the facts, which is like, maybe it is, but almost certainly it's not, you know, and young people forget things too all the time, and you're not going to lose any more of your functional memory than you already have, right? Then you are less stressed, which makes you healthier. So it's really, it's about education. It's about learning the full picture. The more you know about aging, the less scary it is, partly we all start out so scared.
Yeah, absolutely. And having a mother who had dementia, it is something that preys on my mind, and
Imagine.
it runs in the family, and it's like, nope, that's not my not going there, just not going to do it, just like I decided I wasn't going to do menopause. So, and part of that is really getting, like you said, aware and not jumping to the conclusion, and really focusing on what is good about this, what is working. So let's talk about ageism and language, because I know you're a big advocate of that. You've got a blog called Yo, Is This Ageist? Did I get the title right? Which I love, that has a lot of conversation around how we frame things, how we think of things, and how we talk about things. What are some of your biggest pet peeves in terms of language that we use around aging?
Well, I guess a small pet peeve is the way we use aging as an adjective in cases where we should use older. Aging parents, aging celebrities. We are aging from the minute we are born. So aging is actually, it's like aging, population aging, that's a thing. An aging population means more people statistically in that population group are old. But by and large, we should use older and younger because they are actually descriptive. Aging is living. We are aging from the minute we're born. Another one, and I guess if I would throw out one sort of habit, and we all do these things, everyone is ageist, no judgment at all. Believe me, I say and think ageist things all the time, but is to think about how you use the words old and young. You know, when I touched on it saying there's no such thing as too old, you might be too lazy, you might be too smart, you might be too out of shape, you might have done it last Tuesday. But there are other people your age who cannot do that thing, who do not want to do that thing. And there are others your age who are doing it all the time, right? Age is never the reason we are qualified for or interested in a thing. So dig into what is actually going on, you know, what the actual feeling or emotion or reason why you said that, and use that actual thing instead. People say, I feel so young. What they mean is I feel energetic, right? I feel sexy. I feel with it. Well, we can feel that way at any age. And when I think back to how I felt at 13, I have never been more miserable,
Yes,
right?
exactly. Mhm.
Never a function of age.
Right. Yes. And it is also got all sorts of connotations on it. There's all sorts of societal messaging around old. There's tons of stuff around we should be young, smooth, et cetera, et cetera.
And
And
old shouldn't be a dirty word. You know,
yeah.
it's a perfectly good word. I want to mention a website called Old School.
Mhm.
Oldschool.info. It's the Old School Anti-Ageism Clearinghouse, and it contains hundreds of carefully vetted resources. I co-created it with two colleagues. Everything is free except the books. So if
Mhm.
we talk about a subject that is interesting to one of your listeners, workplace, gender, language,
Mhm.
images, enter it in the search field and you will get a whole list of up-to-date, really good resources on ageism from
Mhm.
that perspective.
Awesome. And I heartily endorse that website. That's oldschool.info. It has fascinating information on it and things that you wouldn't normally find. When I launched my podcast, I went and looked to see what other podcasts there were in this genre of dealing with an aging population and olders and what are we doing and reinventing how we think of this. I call it how we think about aging, saging, and living at this stage of life. And I was surprised and shocked to find all of these podcasts that are on there that did not show up in any of my research. So you guys have done some deep
Oh,
dive.
I'm glad.
Yeah, and I was thrilled and dismayed that I hadn't found them before because I went looking and couldn't find them.
Well,
So
often it's a single episode of a given podcast, you
yeah,
know, which makes sense. I mean, I don't know of any podcasts that are focused uniquely on ageism, which makes sense because, you know, that's what we do, but aging and age bias affect every aspect of being human. So
yes.
if you have a healthcare podcast or a beauty podcast or whatever, a pet raising, you know, there are all sorts of rules in various municipalities. For example, I mean, I honestly, that just flew into my head. But say if you are over a certain age, you cannot adopt a cat or a dog, for example. So there's, you know,
Yes, exactly. And part of the education around this is we don't know what we don't know, and we don't know what we've been cultured or brought up with, the beliefs that are just like on the end of our nose. There are so many things that you've said in your book that I went, oh, yeah, good point. Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, I hadn't thought of that before. And so I highly recommend the book, and I highly recommend really getting more educated about this. It's a lot like thinking, oh, I'm not racist, when in reality, when you dive into it, you are. And or I am. And the same with ageism. I didn't think of myself as ageist. I tend to be very do what I want to do, how I want to do it, when I want to do it. Yes, there are days I wake up feeling, crickety and decrepit and weak. And there's days that I wake up with, taking the world on fire kind of thing. But
and
um
that was true when you were 20.
exactly. And yes, there are changes. And I tend to think differently than a lot of people that I know, but I thought that meant that I wasn't ageist until I started reading some of the documentation and ideas and how we talk about it, how we think about it, and what we do and how we treat one another. What are
Well,
some
thank
of
you.
the
I
things?
appreciate your vulnerability because that is the most essential first step, and it's not comfortable. None of us wants to think of ourselves
Yep.
as biased. So I really appreciate that because it means my book has done the most important thing that I hoped it would. But I bet you will agree with my next statement, which is that once we start to see this bias in ourselves, and most bias is unconscious, as you say, we don't know it's there and we don't want to acknowledge it particularly. But once you see it in yourself, it's like letting a genie out of a bottle. Then you start to see it
Mhm.
in magazines, in movies, on billboards, and that is liberating, right? Then you realize, oh, it's not that I'm a bad person or I didn't get the memo or I failed. It's embedded in systems around us, and
Yeah.
that means we can come together and do something about it.
Exactly. Yep, absolutely love that. And I love that there is what I see is a much, well, there is a much larger movement afoot around what some call the aging revolution or reinventing this notion and addressing ageism than I was aware of course, because I wasn't in that world and wasn't looking. But there's still not a lot of events that are not about what I call retiring. So, events that are about buying your burial plot and picking out your senior's home and Viagra, versus events that are about those that are inspiring or refiring or choosing a different way of living their life. So I was happy to find a lot of those resources on your site, but there's still not a lot out there in terms of this, in my experience, in terms of this kind of, I wouldn't say different way of thinking, but it is different to many people. It's and so what would you say around that in terms of how people can find other people like them to surround ourselves with, because we become like the people, we're the five closest people we have around us and the communities we surround ourselves with. How do you find people that support you in having a healthier, more productive approach to aging, to being older, to living?
Well, I have both a very broadband answer and a very narrow band answer. The narrow band answer is that Old School, and by the way, I don't make 10 cents from Old School, is, believe me, a nonprofit. But we host at oldschool.info. If you go to our events page, which is right there on the homepage, and or subscribe to our newsletter, we host a weekly open to anyone Zoom meeting called office hours.
Yes.
And all three co-creators are usually there. I'm almost always there. And it is just an open, informal conversation to talk about anything ageism related. And so that is one community I can offer membership in. It's very exclusive. Anyone can join. The other piece of advice I would give is to point out that making a significantly older or younger friend is itself an anti-ageist act. And to think of something you like to do and find a mixed age group to do it with. If you have a dinner party, it's not easy. It doesn't come automatically. We tend to, of course, associate with people who look like ourselves. But if you can reach across age lines, and ideally also, across, the more mixy-uppy, as I say, the better. The more we learn from people whose experience is different from ours. So reading group, cooking club, hiking, gardening, whatever. Either invite someone to an event who's older or younger than you. By diversifying our age social circles, it, like anything, if you only hang out with white people, it's, you might believe that Black people are like you this way, different from you in this way, but only by meeting people of color do you actually learn it in a way that, because we're animals and we need stories and we need the face-to-face thing. We think we give age much more credit than it deserves in shaping affinity, when in fact, because we spend most of our time hanging out with people who are the same age or close, so we think that's why we get along. But in fact, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender, all have much, much, much more to do with shaping what we like and what we do. So, and the minute you're with a diverse group, you realize that you may not be able to stand that 17-year-old across from you, but it's not because of how old they are. It's because you don't agree with their politics or they offended you or whatever.
Yes, absolutely. And it really helps us to see that we have more in common across those bands than we have differences. And so it really to help with that, or to alleviate some of that us versus themnism. One of the things that I was really made aware of when I was reading this was your comment about let's not just highlight the exceptions to the rule. And that is, on this podcast, a big portion of what I want to do is provide spectrum, provide perspectives on what is possible and what are some of the thought-provoking ways that we can think outside of whatever the box may be that we're in. And I also don't want to be that person who is featuring only the exception to the rule. And so talk a little bit about why it's important to recognize the whole spectrum of it, including those who do want to spend the next 30 years knitting or golfing or whatever,
Yeah.
and not being, a world-changing entrepreneur or something along those lines.
Right. There's always this discourse around purpose, finding your purpose. And if your purpose is to cure cancer, more power to you. But purpose can also be writ small. It can be to plant your garden in the spring. It can be to see a friend's kid graduate from college. It can be any scale. We live in a very driven, capitalistic, action-oriented, speed-oriented society. And those are not values that are kind to us as we age, because no matter how well you're doing it, you're going to slow down, right? And because of discrimination and bias, you're going to have fewer opportunities. So I think and most of us have this very negative conception. I write about this in the introduction to my book because I think sort of the swing of the pendulum that I experienced is very typical. People, especially privileged people with the time and the opportunity to think about these things because they're not busy working 3 jobs to pay the rent. Once they sort of get the memo and they're like, hey, I'm 50 or 60 or whatever, and I feel at the height of my powers and I am enjoying my life. And, for women, we feel liberated, and they go, oh, it's not all going to suck. It's going to be great. And if I eat enough kale, if I start enough podcasts, if I run enough marathons, and that's the other end of the pendulum. And it is a very classist, and sorry to be so harsh, but and an ableist, meaning it ignores incapacity, it ignores luck, right? It assumes that we all have equal access to leisure time, to healthcare, to travel, to time to read, right? And we really want a view of late life that embraces all the people who aren't lucky enough to have those opportunities, or who are less ambitious, or who want to sit in the porch swing and read their detective novel. No shame. If that's what you want to do and you can afford it, more power to you. And the other piece of that is that even these super achievers, who are out there running companies and running marathons, sooner or later, they're not going to be able to do that. And we want a compassionate society that doesn't say, oh, you failed, or, oh, I can't hang out with you anymore because you're using a walker and that makes me look bad. We want a big basket that has room for everybody.
Right. And that your value doesn't come from the marathon, that your value comes from the person and the spirit inside that might have you want to run a marathon one day and hang out with your grandkids the next. And that's the richness of it.
Yeah.
What would you say is the one piece of advice you would give someone who is an older, who may be thinking that's it, it's downhill, the typical kind of framing that we often hear? What's one piece of advice you would give them about where to start with shifting that mindset?
Listen to my TED Talk. It's 11 minutes long. And my website is thischairrocks.com, and there's a button right there. Or I'm the only person with my name. So if you can't find my TED Talk, you don't really want to change. Sorry to be snarky, but when people say, oh, I wondered how to get hold of you, I'm like, you didn't try for more than 10 seconds.
Yeah.
And I would say also read my book. I mean, that's a bigger ask, but it's fun to read. And it really is the best book on the subject. But if you think I'm just pimping me, go to oldschool.info and look at books. Look at it, honestly, noodle around Old School, because people learn in different ways. You may not want to read my book. You may not have 8 hours to read a book, but you could listen to a podcast. You could look at an infographic. You could watch a video. It's all sorts of introductions to this subject in every format and at different lengths. Even we have some stuff translated into other languages. We'd love to have more if anyone there has any free time to translate things. And just educate yourself, because I think I already said, the more you know, the less scary it is. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I totally endorse and support you in checking out the TED Talk and the book. Part of the reason why I wanted you on the podcast early, even though it's not well established and known yet, is because I want this to set a tone, and everybody who comes back to the beginning to get this information, because I think it is so valuable in terms of the education and the perspective on it. Because
Thank you.
it's not, well, as you can tell, she is biased and clear on the bias, and very honest about, and direct and straightforward about your perspective and your positions. And it is also incredibly well researched and objective. And so I love that combination.
And
And
this, so it's different for everybody, you
yeah,
know, aging. And we each have to navigate this stuff in our own way and at our own speed. It's doubly complicated for women because we face the double whammy, you know, the intersection of ageism and sexism. A loss for me, I have arthritis. I had to have a total shoulder replacement. Well, there goes my tennis serve, except guess what? I don't play tennis. You know, so but for I'm not being flip. It's for someone who played tennis, that would be a terrible loss. Except
yeah.
honestly, I could do a shoulder advertisement, but so bad example, but you see what I mean. I mean, I live in New York City where I don't have to drive much. If I lost my night vision, most people in the US are tremendously dependent on being able to drive, you know, or we have, well, some of us have more support to pick up the slack with something. Some of us have skills that that are easier to bring out in the community, or where we know how to put ourselves out there. Each person's situation is different. Right. So no, there's no such thing as a one size fits all solution. And if I could put one fact in the minds of everyone about aging, well, there's about 1 million of them, but it would be the fact that the longer we live, the more different from one another we become. It's why, you know, those marketing checklists that see, you know, 18 to 22 and then 22 to 33, and then they stop at 65 or 50 even.
Yeah.
That population is so much more diverse economically, geographically, cognitively, physically, socially than the 40 years before it. And so we're, you know, and that's what makes it so interesting.
Right. Well, while we're on the topic of generational bans, tell us what you think about talking about the different generations and why you don't think that's a good idea.
Yeah. You know, the word generation has no scientific basis except in the context of our children being a different generation from us and our grandparents. In that narrow biological sense, that is a generation. But there is no other agreed upon scientific definition. It is an invention of marketers and demographers, and they love these things, and so do we as humans, because we like to put things in buckets and we like to belong to groups, and none of us can resist those really annoying clickbait ads about, you know, 10 things boomers shouldn't wear, or why, you know, why Gen Zers are so awful. But they do not bring out the best in us. No generalization about millions of people, you know, born roughly around the same time could possibly be accurate. The minute we have a generational label, all sorts of preconceptions click into place for all of us. I'm not free of that habit, right? And that is the epitome of an age stereotype, right? And it segregates us. And I mean, it's very used a lot to sell us things. It's used a lot in the workplace. Oh, we need to, like, you know, develop new strategies for dealing with Gen X. Well, maybe, you know, there are small things, but the real data shows that what people want from an employer and a job is much more in common. You already said this, then differs. We all want flex time. We all want to be respected. We all want to have opportunities to be heard. We all want to be able to leave that job with, you know, with our dignity intact, and in a way that we can pass on what we know, right? So, and it's more accurate just to say older and younger. And in fact, this came up when we were speaking, because you mentioned generations, and then you said I believe your audience is people over 50?
55, yep.
55. That is the accurate way to put it. You're not saying what label you're trying to reach, right? So just use older people or young people if you can get away without even an age limit, because there's 45-year-olds who need to hear what you have to say.
That's true. Very true.
Right? There's 20-year-olds.
Yes. And it's a very interesting notion, because maturepreneurs, which is a lot of what this is about, are, like you said, anywhere from 40 to 90 and perhaps even younger. There's a tremendous value in wisdom for people of every age in
Yeah,
this
some young
discussion.
people are wise.
Yeah.
Some old people are idiots.
Yeah, exactly. And you're absolutely right. The lady that I'm staying with here while I'm in Florida because I'm avoiding winter in Canada is 20 years older than me. We're both members of the baby boomer generation, and we could not be more different in so many ways. We are good friends, we like each other, but we are diametrically opposed politically. We have different religious foundations, we have different experience bases, we have different music tastes. Like, we could not be more different, and yet we can still connect on many fronts. But to say that we're both the same and should be marketed to the same and treated the same is just silly.
Yeah,
um
it's divisive and it's inaccurate. And if you just literally say, talk about older people
mhm,
or younger people,
yeah,
it's inclusive and it's accurate.
mhm, yeah, yeah, I think that's great advice. Two other quick kind of personal questions, just as an aside from all of this. If you could go back to any moment in history and participate, what moment would you pick and why? I know it's completely off topic.
I don't have a good answer. I mean, I probably would off the top of my head have said, Europe during the Enlightenment, but now I have a better sense of how much that was about, wealthy white men and, going and grabbing stuff from around the world and imposing all sorts of colonial hierarchies on what they learned and the people they met.
Mhm.
So I still think it'd be a fascinating time to be around. I guess the Enlightenment, knowing what I know now, which is of course impossible.
And what do you hope your legacy will be?
I hope my legacy will be to have helped people change the way they think and feel about aging. And amazingly, I think that legacy is already, sort of established. I mean, we'll see where it goes. Ageism. I also I hope that the Old School Clearinghouse will persist. My two colleagues who co-created it with me happen to be in their 30s.
Hmm.
And I take enormous comfort in the fact that they're really likely to outlive me. And I hope that will keep going.
I love it. And by the way, that is a nonprofit that you can donate to, and I highly encourage it. We were talking earlier about the fact that there is not a lot of funding that goes towards this cohort of olders. It was thought that we are all well established and all have money and don't need any kind of support, which, as we know, of any group, that's not necessarily true. So you can go to Old School info. Is that, did I get that right? Old School.
That's it. Oldschool.info.
Yep. And donate, as well
That would
as
be amazing.
look around and see what's there, see what you can learn. Be curious. I think one of the biggest,
Nothing will go to overhead, believe me.
yeah. And I think that curiosity is one of the things, you were talking about, educate yourself, really being curious about what else is possible at this stage or any age. One of the best questions I've ever asked myself in terms of business is, what would be fun and how do I get someone to pay me to do that? And I think that still persists in my life, is what would be fun and what do I want to learn next? I think that is a big part of what we can do to support overcoming any isms, is really find out more about the topic, about the people, about what we're really talking about the reality of it. There's so many people who think, oh, sexism doesn't exist anymore, or ageism isn't that big a thing. I was on a cruise and was personally confronted with it, kind of a longer story, but basically was every single woman over 60 there was completely invisible and 100% ignored. And when I took it to the three older white men that organized it and brought it to their attention, they're like, oh no, that's not a thing. It's a thing. That's what took me down this path and had me want to find out more. So I really appreciate finding resources like the ones you've provided and the education, and starting to be aware of this thing and how we can reinvent ourselves and the world around this. How do we create more awareness and then some new actions? What's one last piece of advice or information or question that you'd like to leave everyone with, Ashton?
Well, as you can tell, I have nothing prepared. Educate yourself, make an older or younger friend, And just think, when a thought about aging crops into your mind, just stop for a second and think about it. Think what value, because age is real. It's an important part of our identity. Where we get into trouble is when we ascribe a value to it, whether positive or negative, that younger is better, that older people are wise. That's still a stereotype, right? So just stop for a minute and think, gee, was that an assumption? Did age have anything? If you bring age into something, does age really have anything to do with it? Like a newspaper story, about a guy who, ran for office or whatever. Is age really relevant? And is there a value attached to it? Because the answer is almost always no, it's not relevant. Yes, there's a value attached to it, and that's ageism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for that. That's a great final reminder. I highly recommend that you go and get This Chair Rocks, a Manifesto Against Ageism. Even if it's not something on your radar right now, it is a fascinating, eye-opening, and gets you thinking about things beyond just aging. How do we think about, frame, and bring isms to any arena in our life? So thank you for being an advocate for this. Thank you for being here and providing your perspective. I love your clarity and appreciate the difference you're making. Thanks, Ashton.
Thank you, Jeanette. My pleasure.
Thank you for listening. I'd love it if you left a comment and subscribed. And I encourage you to apply one aha from this interview right away so you can turn your wisdom into wealth and your contribution into positive change. Bye for now.